Good evening, welcome. My name is David Willits, Chair of the Foundation for Science and Technology. Thank you very much for joining our discussion this evening on future priorities for UKRI. And we very much appreciate the support of the Physiological Society who have made this event possible. We're going to hear from three speakers. We will hear first from Dame Ottlyn Liza, who is, of course, the new head of UKRI, then from Professor David Patterson, who is head of the Department of Physiology at the University of Oxford, and then from Priya Guha, who is a venture partner at Merian Ventures. Just before we turn to then, I should just say on the practicalities that we are particularly keen to encourage Q&A and do start, as set out here in this slide in front of you, do use the Q&A, hopefully for more interesting questions than is it raining in your area today. And of course, do upvote if you see a question there you strongly support. It's a great help as chair to be able to see the questions that are getting most support. Well, the subject of our discussion this evening is future priorities for UKRI. And we're fantastic to have as our first speaker, Professor Dame Ottlyn Liza, who of course became Chief Executive of UKRI back in the summer, in June. She is a Professor of Plant Development at the University of Cambridge. She has arrived at UKRI at a very exciting time. The overall R&D roadmap has been published, but there's a lot to be done to fill that out and to apply it. There's a range of incredibly hot topics on her desk: COVID, Brexit, levelling up, ARPA, the new REF. So there is a lot for us to talk about. And after we've heard from Ottlyn, we'll then have comments from Professor Patterson, focusing perhaps more on the research side, and then from Priya Guha, perhaps focusing more on the application and the commercialization side. But first of all, Ottlyn, thank you very much for sparing the time to join us this evening, and we very much look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak to this wonderful audience about my early thinking on UKRI and its role in the UK research and innovation system, which is a real strength for the UK, and I think can play a really important role as we seek to climb out of these various shocks that have hit us and are apparently continuing to hit us. So I have a few slides which I think explain how we're moving. Here we go. So UK research and innovation, for those who, oops, now this is interesting. My ability to change slides doesn't seem to be happening. I wonder why that is.
Ah, right.
I'll do the thing where you turn it off and on again, just to see if something like that might work. Yes, there you go. It always works. Turn it off and on again. Right. So UK research innovation, for those who are not familiar with it, although I'm sure most people are, is the largest public funder of research and innovation in the UK. It's a relatively young organisation. We're 2.5 years old now. And we were formed on the recommendations of the Nurse Review, bringing together 9 previous organisations, 7 disciplinary research councils, Innovate UK, the UK's innovation agency, and Research England, who are working closely with equivalent organisations in the Devolved Administrations Fund, the university system with the QR dual support, and also a lot of work on knowledge exchange. And so, I mean, I find it a really exciting organisation precisely because under the one umbrella, there are the full range of disciplines the full range of organizations who are involved in research and innovation, and deep expertise and understanding of those disciplinary and domain experts. And bringing all of that knowledge and expertise together, I think, creates extraordinary opportunities to capture synergies and really to get the most out of our research and innovation system, which, as I've said, is really a strength for the UK. Now, obviously, this size of organisation and this extraordinary public investment makes us accountable to government. And key to our operation, I think, are our partnerships with academia, with businesses, with government, and a whole range of different publics, the public sector, the third sector, and of course, crucially, internationally. So I see our job really as to think about the whole research and innovation system because of the breadth of coverage we have of that system and the deep partnerships with all the stakeholders from right across the system, and to use that understanding and intelligence of the system to build a holistic system. I've said system about 50 times by now already, that genuinely works to deliver for the UK. And so that's kind of captured here on our refreshed vision, which is to build this world-leading, creative, dynamic research and innovation system for the UK. And it has got to be a truly inclusive system. So it has to be a system in which everyone can participate and from which everyone can benefit. I think that's crucial to how we work. And to do that, we need to build the strong partnerships I've mentioned with key stakeholders. And whilst we are a major player in the system, we are definitely not all of it. But because of the join up we have right across it, I think our key and unique opportunity is to steward the research and innovation system, think about the whole thing, and to think about the levers we have to fuel then this connected, embedded research and innovation system with a way of working that really works for everybody. And as I say, we have a variety of levers to do that. Of course, we have money, we can invest. We can invest money in people and ideas and infrastructures and build a portfolio of investment that really serves that whole system. But also we have other tools. We can convene and catalyze, we can bring people together in different groups, we can listen to a whole range of different communities to understand how different people view and want to shape and want to contribute to and want to benefit from the research and innovation in the UK. And of course, we can incentivize, we can have quite a significant influence on how the system works through the various incentive levers that we have. And then we mustn't forget that as UKRI, we also actually have a large part of our organisation that directly conducts research. So we run a number of major facilities and research institutes, and all of the things I'm talking about, and we need to set an example, and the research that we directly conduct must be of the quality and integrity that we expect from the whole system. So I've said system, as I said a million times already, and that's because that's very much how I think about the research and innovation system. And I think if we don't think about it as that in that connected, joined up way, we will not get out of it what we need. And I think it's one of the key problems is that we tend to think about research and innovation as this linear process where there's some discoveries at one end and some magical translational process converts them into products at the other end. And that's very much how we articulate what's going on in the system and how we deploy a lot of the tools that we have. We invest, for example, in discovery, and we measure discovery through measuring publications, and we invest in products, and we measure products by measuring GDP or patents. There's a whole variety of things. And thinking about it in this way, it makes some sense. But if you only think about it in this way, you miss key elements in the system. So the linearity, which I say is an unhelpful way of thinking about it, it's a simplification. People know it's a simplification, but nonetheless, it's how we tend to describe the relationship. And there is a well-known problem in the country where we think we're extraordinarily good at this discovery end, and somehow there is the famous valley of death between this and the product end. And the description of the valley of death tends to be in the context of money. There's missing money in that part of the line along that linear translational pathway. And I think that's true, and we understand that, and and there are ways we can address it. But personally, I think at least as big a problem is the balkanization of these two parts of the system, because to get that effective system working, it's not a linear pathway between one or the other. What we view as the research and innovation system is the tip of the iceberg, and an effective system requires us to think much more holistically about what's in the system, who's in the system, what we need to make it work effectively. And this is where I think UKRI needs to focus. We need to think not only about discoveries and products, but we also need to think crucially about connectivity. We need to think about how they're joined up and who joins them up. And I think people are absolutely key to this. So whilst we tend to think about these kind of lone researchers sitting in their labs or libraries doing their research, we have to think much more broadly. We have to think about where they come from and where they go to. We have to think about who comes into the system from schools, from further education colleges. We have to think much more broadly than just the researcher of a particular sort. We have to think about all the support systems they need to work, their IT staff, their administrative staff, their project leaders, their librarians, their archivists, their technicians, all of those different types of people. They all come into the system from across the education system, and they move across it into the other domains where research is being conducted. So that's another thing we need to think about. There's public sector research establishments, there's small companies, big companies, and a whole ecosystem of institutions that are delivering research, and we need to connect those up. And very much in the context of that discovery product relationship, we need people and ideas to move freely through this system, and it is particularly through moving people that the join up happens. You can publish papers and you can hope people read them, but really all of that knowledge and skill and ideas and expertise moves best on legs. We need to have a system that incentivizes all those different kinds of people to come in, and all of those different kinds of people to move through very flexible career paths across the system. And currently, our incentive structures, the way we fund things, the whole culture of our research and innovation system is quite balkanized, with academic careers or business careers and some crossover between the two, but not nearly enough, and not nearly in enough different directions, and not nearly with enough different entry points. So very traditional school, PhD, I mean, undergraduate degree, PhD, off you go, rather than alternative ways to move through that structure and bring in a much wider range of different kinds of people. So I think a lot of these ideas are wonderfully encapsulated in the R&D roadmap that David mentioned at the beginning. It sets out, I think, very clearly this whole system idea with very high ambition to drive our research system forward, to bring in a much wider range of people, and to connect up our discovery research base to innovation and productivity. And through that combination of things, drive leveling up in R&D across the UK. So that truly inclusive system to which everyone can contribute and from which everyone benefits. And to do that, of course, we need world-leading infrastructures and institutions, so it's kind of physical and also social infrastructures to bring the right kinds of people together in the right kinds of combinations, and to connect up the UK system globally and ensure that the system is healthy and sustainable and has a really vibrant and creative culture. And this is what I see the focus for UKRI. Because we cover the whole system, because we span right across it, we have the opportunity, I think, really to understand the system and to understand the points of influence that will best join it up to create this much more vibrant and inclusive system that I think we need, particularly in a post-COVID world where we need to build back better, as the phrase goes. So that's very much how I see the path ahead. I don't think it'll be this straight, but I hope at least it will be this sunny. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Odeline. And a very clear focus there on thinking of this as a system, and that I'm sure will help shape our discussion subsequently. Now I'm turning to our second speaker, Professor David Patterson. He's head of the Department of Physiology, Anatomy and Genetics at the University of Oxford and has been elected president of the Physiological Society. David, over to you.
Thank you, David, for the introduction and also the opportunity to speak. I've been asked to comment briefly on the R part of the UKRI future priorities. And in my first slide, I borrowed this quote from the famous French mathematician and physicist Pascal, because in many ways, listening to Dame Ottoline, I think this kind of encapsulates the sort of big high-level picture of UKRI to an extent from what I've been reading. So Pascal said, I hold it equally impossible to know the parts without knowing the whole, and to know the whole without knowing the parts in detail. And of course, never has this been more important today. And if we take the area of biomedical sciences just as the example, for the last 25 years, we've really been in the post-genomic world where we've been interested in genes encoding proteins and what those proteins do to cell.
David, sorry to interrupt. Sorry, we're seeing you, which is wonderful. We're not seeing your slides.
Okay. So let me.
No,
I did go share screen. So can I maybe start again on the share screen bit? Can you?
We are still seeing you.
Okay. Can you see?
Oh, yeah, now that's right. We're okay. We're in business.
Okay, let me not repeat my introduction. So this is what I said just by putting words to the script. And this is the next point I'd really like to make, that, you know, in the last 25 years, we've been in this really post-genomic period, interested in how genes encode proteins and how proteins affect cells. But what is really becoming more apparent is that as well as working in the reductive domains, we need to work across the whole spatial scale. That is, we need to be able to reassemble complexity at the genetic area right through to us as humans. And of course, this has never been more important than where we are at the moment in the middle of a pandemic. So the opportunities with UKRI science model, the government's R&D roadmap and also coupled to the industrial strategy has some fairly clear challenges. Healthy aging is one of them, which the Physiological Society, of course, is very interested in. But academics, of course, like the second point here, that is the commitment of government to double public R&D spending to £22 billion by 2025. And hopefully, with the comprehensive spending round, we will actually get to this point. Another area I picked out, which I thought was very good, was the knowledge exchange framework. That is to maximize and translate into impact. And of course, where we are at the moment in a major national, indeed world crisis with this current pandemic, I think the signs of a mature science country is its ability to respond quickly, repurpose what you're doing, realign. And these are all characteristics of being agile. And you can tell from my Antipodean accent, I'm not British, but I actually think the UK science base has done exceptionally well here and is really leading at the moment. And just to reiterate the Pascal bit, the philosophy here, that is to be able to set a framework up, especially a funding framework, where we can still focus on the reductive aspects of our science, but importantly, not to lose sight of the whole. that is the integrated nature of physiology here, because COVID-19 is a multi-organ disease. And this is classically where three disciplines meet around the fringes: physiology, neuroscience, and immunology. And to be able to set up funding structures in a response mode to deal with this, I think is going to be very important if we're to tackle this particular beast. Now, there are a number of big challenges, and hopefully some of these might come out in questions and discussion, but let me park COVID for the moment. I think one of the ones that's really looming, and I'll be interested in Ottoline's view here on this, that obviously at the end of the year, the United Kingdom leaves the EU, and therefore we need to know about the access of British universities to the ERC discovering pot. And I think that's going to be very important, because there's this real tension, the way we fund science, the tension between discovery versus mission. And to get that balance right is going to be very important. The Haldane principle has always underpinned the philosophy behind British funding and science. And again, I was pleased to see aspects of Haldane principle in the mission aspect of UKRI. So I think that's really good. Of course, discovery science and mission science, these are not mutually exclusive. I think history is littered with terrific examples of where mission can drive discovery. We kind of call this serendipity, I guess. But if you look at war efforts, we get many advances in medicine and surgery. The NASA moonshot really advanced material sciences and communication systems. But the two big elephants in the science room for me really the pressure on the QR model, the dual support model. This is the quantum for quality research. And the reality is, in research intensive universities at the moment, this current model is really driving huge deficits within these institutions. And then we've got REF, which is the framework to help facilitate the distribution of QR. And having sat on these panels over the last two exercises, I just like to sort of pose the fairly provocative question, is REF really fit for purpose? It's very costly in terms of time and of course money. We spend hundreds of millions of pounds running this exercise every 6 or 7 years. And what does it actually tell us that we don't already know? My final slide, I guess, are some questions which might come out in discussion a little bit later. But again, I think from an academic point of view in universities, we're very interested in what success looks like. That is the time frame for success, what's the appropriate metric of success. And my question is really predicated going back to these 2 points here: mission science and discovery science. Mission science, more linear. It's easy to put metrics on it because you can set up milestones to make measurements. But discovery science is way more difficult. It's very non-linear and it's hard to quantify because the time frame is very long here. In fact, history is often the best judge of that. And the discovery can often go beyond many, many parliaments. So academics are really left with the question, if government is going to put in £22 billion worth of funding, that is doubling the funding budget, then what will they be looking for? What will be their time frame? What will success look like for them? Because success in terms of quality often can take a long time to come through the system. So if I could just pause there and stop.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, David. And now we turn to our third speaker, Priya Guha, who is a venture partner at Marion Ventures. She is a member of the Innovate UK Council. And I think back a decade or so to when she became our Consul General in San Francisco and did a fantastic job of introducing me and a string of British ministerial visitors to the extraordinary phenomenon of the US West Coast. And it's great to see her putting that knowledge to good use today. So Priya, over to you.
Thank you so much, David, and a real pleasure to be here. So Professor David Patterson was asked to address the R end of the equation. I'm here really to look at the D end of the equation. So what should we be thinking about for the commercialization of the fabulous research we have coming out of the UK, and really what do we need to be doing better at in the future? Now, I should say that whilst being a member of the Innovate UK Council, what I'm saying today is really in my personal capacity. I am a diplomat by historical background, as David rightly referenced, but have spent the last 5 years working in tech back here in the UK in a number of different private sector roles, most recently as an investor myself. So I wanted really to start by picking up what Ottiline talked about in the context of systems, and maybe use a slightly different phrase, an ecosystem. Silicon Valley is often talked about as the center for innovation and commercialization. The reality is Silicon Valley is a very complex beast made up of lots of different factors. I'm sure everybody on the call would be familiar with them, but if you look at it, it really incorporates some fantastic academic institutions. It incorporates an investor base. It incorporates a very strong government presence. Professor Patterson talked about the impact of the war effort to stimulate research. And that was happening in spades in terms of the US government's operations out there on the West Coast during the Second World War, and actually led to many of the innovations we're familiar with today, including things like, of course, the internet. And then on top of that, you have talent. You have a very high immigration talent. You also have a talent that recycles itself within the businesses that are there in the Bay Area. A talent that is constantly upskilling and reapplying those skills to new and innovative ideas and businesses. So if you take that model of what an ecosystem looks like and translates it to the UK, I think we should start by recognizing that we have a very strong innovation ecosystem for commercialization of companies. But the reality, of course, is that COVID has hit that quite starkly, both in terms of the broader economy, but also very specifically in terms of startups' ability to retain their talent, to be able to get the investment they need, and to be able to retain their customer-facing market activity. Which is why really interventions that the government made during the COVID pandemic were really crucial. Many of you will probably be familiar with a 1.25 billion package of COVID support that the government set out to support small businesses of all different shapes and sizes, but very explicitly businesses that were startups using technology as their business commercialization idea going to scale. And Innovate UK was in the position of managing about £750 million of that in the form of everything from small grants for COVID-related innovations to things like innovation loans to support a remaining focus on the commercialization of new technologies, even when businesses are at a later stage. So COVID has been one of the blips that the startup ecosystem has had to face in the UK. But the reality is that it has also been a catalyst for technological adoption. If you look at even simple statistics like healthcare, pre-pandemic, only about 8% of the UK's population were comfortable in doing an appointment with their GP online rather than in person. The pandemic has changed that completely. Now about 80% of the British population are willing to do that. So it has created an acceleration of technological adoption and an opportunity, therefore, for us to be rebuilding an economy post-pandemic that is very much thinking of innovation at its front and center. But I wanted to maybe spend the last couple of minutes of my remarks focusing on, I think, two areas that are both opportunities and challenges for how we build that economy better post-pandemic. The first is an area that I've been working on for many years now, which is really around the broad issue of equality, diversity, and inclusion in the economy, and specifically in the tech sector. The figures currently for equality, diversity, and inclusion in tech are quite stark. If you look at the money that goes into female founders, only about 1 pence in every pound of UK VC investment goes to female founders. If you look at a report that just came out today by Extend Ventures, Black founders in the UK have only had access to 0.24% of capital in the UK. Why does that matter? Well, I think the really important piece that we need to focus on as the opportunity here is that actually, if we think about innovation as something that can both build in equality and diversity and inclusion in its design, i.e. make sure that algorithms are not designed to be biased towards the only a small segment of the population on which they have been tested, for example, but also think about actually how can you achieve full market opportunity by designing products that work to the broad population, including women, including minorities. We have a much bigger opportunity for the innovation economy to be designed in an inclusive way, but also to be marketed and grow to a much broader swathe of the global population. So I think for me, equality, diversity, and inclusion has to be a really fundamental part of how we think about where we invest. And one of the really important things to consider is how we track the data relating to that investment, whether that's private sector investment or indeed government investment, where I do fundamentally believe that government investment can be used as a spur to change behaviors where we have seen historically an underrepresentation of certain groups. The second area I wanted to focus on is really around scale-ups. Scale-ups are a later stage of the innovation ecosystem, but a stage which is really, really important economically, both because that is the point at which the startup ideas are becoming commercially viable and have the potential to reach international markets and go global. In the UK, we are historically very strong on scale-ups. We have about 33,000 scale-ups in the UK, according to the latest reports. But what we need to think about is what are the barriers in us having more scale-ups in the UK, and how can we support that from a UKRI and innovation ecosystem perspective? And whilst it is not the be-all and end-all by a long shot, a key part of that is, of course, funding. British Patient Capital today released their latest report on the status of funding that they give. And they report that B rounds, or rounds later than Series B in the UK, are generally about half the size of the US equivalent rounds. Well, what does that mean? It means that actually the companies in the UK, these scale-ups in the UK, are vulnerable to takeovers from the US, and will find their global scaling market potential limited because they are at a weaker financial position than their counterparts. So scale-ups is also, I think, a really important area for the future of UKRI to be considering, how we can support that later stage commercialization, fundamentally because it brings economic value. If you look at that sector of the economy, they fund, it is said that one of those businesses supports about 5 other jobs in the British economy, in the global economy. And if you look at those 33,000 businesses that I mentioned, those are employing about 3.5 million people right here in the UK. So this is an opportunity to build back better, to think about how we incorporate diversity and inclusion into what that building back better looks like, but also how can we make sure that we're building an innovation ecosystem that is both producing the economic value that our research merits, but also doing that in a way that involves the whole of the UK economy. This can't be a story of just a few parts of the UK anymore. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much indeed, Priya. And 2 very important points there, both on diversity and also on scale-ups. Now, can I invite our 3 panelists now to turn on their videos? And I'm going to put the first question to the panelists in the order they spoke, which is really a sort of thread which begins with the top Q&A that's been upvoted the most, and that is, how does our approach compare with other countries? Is the best practice in other countries we can learn from? But I'd like to link that, a couple of other comments. Andy Sellers asked particularly if other countries are more comfortable picking winners than we are. And Brian Bauscher makes a comparison with the US and their network of national labs, a far stronger network than anything we have in the UK. And one could add, of course, that Germany, with its network of Max Planck institutes and Fraunhofer institutes, on which we modeled the catapults, incidentally. So what about other countries? What can we learn from them? Ottilien, we'll start with you.
We can learn lots from other countries. There are many countries who are excellent at research and innovation, and there's a lot of diversity in how different countries do it, which are rooted in quite fundamental differences between the countries. So I think it's really valuable to look at other countries, but to imagine one can pick things up and import them, and that will immediately work in the UK is a dangerous assumption, because these things are systems, and parts of systems are hard to move. Nonetheless, what can we learn? So there's been a lot of discussion about the balance of funding in a variety of ways across the UK system, across the discovery to development spectrum, between universities and institutes, across the country in terms of the concentration in one part of the country, lots and lots of differences. And I think what we can learn, again, I think wholeheartedly just importing those ideas is not useful. But the other thing we have definitely learned is that we invest a very small proportion of our GDP in research and innovation compared to all of those other countries. And in our ambition to drive up that proportion, where we put the new money, I think is a very interesting question. And in the context of rebalancing some of these elements in the system that we see in comparison to other countries might need rebalancing. For example, investment in institutes outside the university system, or institutes that are associated and appropriately networked with the university system, but not the university system. So I think if we manage to get this increased investment, both through the government funding, which is on the table, but also more broadly in driving up the business sector investment, then we are in a position to make those choices much more straightforwardly than when we're having to take money away from one place and give it to another place. So I think I'm quite optimistic, should that money appear, that we will have that chance to rebalance along the many axes that that both David and Priya spoke about.
Yeah, thank you. And I think if you look at our relatively low proportion of GDP going in R&D, you can argue that putting our eggs in that basket of university funding was the correct strategy. But the increase, you're absolutely right, Ottilien, gives us an opportunity, if we so decide, to broaden that out into research institutes. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I think just to elaborate on Ottilien's point, that is, we're starting from a very low baseline relative to our OECD partners. You know, the aspiration of getting to, say, 22 billion only puts us in the average of our OECD equivalent. So the baseline is low. We've got a lot more to do. I think we can learn a lot from our overseas partners for sure. You know, the networks of excellence model is very good. I think that fits in well with the narrative of UKRI in terms of joining up around the country. The discovery base in the UK is terrific, like history has shown that. But the other bit is a bit tougher, isn't it? That is, you know, we had Isaac Newton, but could we put a man on the moon? Well, the answer is no. The Americans could do that. They took the concept of Newton, they took the German physics and engineering, and they had the can-do to make it happen because they had scale. But also in the US, they have a lot of philanthropy that comes into the system. They have a lot of private money. And in the UK, we just don't have the gene for philanthropy in this country to the same extent. So, and that might work around the taxation incentives to give money. I think that's probably the driving factor. But I think we probably are missing a trick here, that in order to scale the operation, we can't always ask the taxpayer to pay for everything. That is, we need industry to get involved. We need private equity to get involved. And I think the combination of those three, partnering our discovery centres, I think would help us for the future. Thank
you very much, David. Priya?
I think the only thing I would add to what Ottoline and David had said is really around one, talent. I talked about a bit in my remarks, but I think that is where you get that ability to learn from international partners, because if we can attract people, as we have always done historically, into the UK, who are both the top class world experts from a research perspective, but also the top class world experts from a startup and scale up perspective, we are setting ourselves up for success. So I think the talent piece is really fundamental. The second element is I do absolutely agree with what David just said in terms of leveraging other forms of capital. This isn't just about government support. And I do think, to his point, the tax structure in the UK does disincentivize large philanthropy in the same way that it's set up to incentivize it in the US. But if you look at the figures, for example, the ones I cited from British Patient Capital that they announced today, the 1.24 billion that they have invested has actually leveraged about 4.8 billion of private sector capital into the UK economy. So there is a huge potential for government funds to be used to leverage other sorts of private capital. And I think that remains a really important way for us to think about making this a sort of whole ecosystem journey.
Thank you very much. Now there's a set of questions about UKRI, but it's not the purpose of this event simply to put sort of Ottoline on the spot. So I'm actually going to start with David and then Priya and give Ottoline the last word. But there's a high on the list of upvoted questions. There's Palab Ghosh saying you may be aware of criticisms from senior lab heads of UKRI's top-down tick box approach. Do you recognize these concerns and how do you plan to address them? And again, there's a thread. I think you could link it up to Jackie Hunter's question, going right back to Ottoline's original point on the Paul Nurse review, asking, given that interdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity was one of Paul's priorities, have there been any changes in the remits of the research councils and how grant panels work that promote such working? And there was also, I think, another UKRI question from David Bolcom. What about where do the research councils fit in? They weren't prominent in Ottoline's presentation. Are they an important part of the system in the future? But let's start with David, your observations on that, then Priya, then Ottoline.
Well, I think it's early days because the experiment is still running. So we're going to have to wait to see how this one rolls out. I do recognize some of the comments and criticisms. I recognize some of the nervousness that has been articulated, especially in the academic sector. Often change will provide people with some uncertainty. And I think often scientists in particular need a stable platform to do their work. And then they want to be left alone. And in many ways, it's the ideal job. But that stable platform is very important because, our job is to hire the best. These are all talented people. And we're not hiring people in a sausage machine to do so-called linear work here. Our game is to get creative people, to provide them a framework and a structure to be successful in, and to be honest, to leave them alone to get on with it. And then we'll come back and audit them later. We already do this with the REF in terms of the audit process. So I guess the Haldane principle bit for me is pretty important here, that combination and tension between what is mission and what is discovery, and getting that balance right. And I don't know whether we have that right yet, but at least we're mindful of it. And listening to Ottoline and reading the reports from UKRI, I think they are mindful. Ottoline will speak for herself in a moment, but I think there are some issues there, but I can't answer directly because I think the experiment's still running.
Thank you. Priya?
I mean, I think I'll give a very short answer to this, which is essentially, I think one of the challenges in the UK historically, which was, essentially one of the factors driving us to create UKRI in the first place, was a lack of continuum between the academic side and the commercialization side. And I say this looking purely from the prism of the sort of Innovate UK commercialization end of the equation. I'm not really qualified to comment on the research end. So I think bringing Innovate UK under the umbrella of the broader UKRI family enables us to have a much more structured approach to thinking about how that continuum works and how that continuum works in both directions. I don't think this is a linear academia to business. I think this also should be business to academia. So we have a constant cycle of that talent going through the system and the ideas being commercialized coming out of it. So I think it is that continuum approach which UKRI has started to embody, and I hopefully will continue to realize in the years ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ottoline. And of course, I should say that as I scroll through all the Q&A, there are also people intervening saying how strongly they support UKRI. But what's your answer to those questions, beginning with Pallab Ghoshi's question?
Yes, so I think I might start at the other end, if that's right, because it sort of builds through. So the way I see UKRI, it is the research councils, and it's fundamentally a federal organization that our entire ability to operate is built on the strength of those 9 organizations, their extraordinary depth of expertise and understanding of their part of the system. And so I think those are absolutely fundamental to the ability of UKRI to operate at all. And so, and then building on that, we need to get the whole to be more than the sum of the parts in what I see to be a kind of meeting of bottom up and top down. And that's always the trick with any kind of large organization or a large system, is to capture the extraordinary kind of vibrancy of bottom up, particularly in a research and innovation context where things are bubbling up all the time that you had no idea what they were going to be or what they would become, with some kind of top-down enabling function that allows you to capture the benefits of all of those things. So it's that balance. And in the context of interdisciplinarity, I think that's a really good example. Yes, there have definitely been changes, just because there's changes across the whole of science, in that most disciplines are much less kind of isolated than they used to be. I came to UKRI from a research institute which was deeply interdisciplinary in combining computational modeling with molecular genetics to try to understand plant developmental processes at multiple scales, very, very similar to what David was talking about, only in a plant context. And so there is interdisciplinarity kind of seeping in through the Research Council base, but at the same time, there are opportunities for cross-council collaborations, which are really quite strong and vibrant. We've been obviously working very hard on our spending review bids, and it's been fantastic to see the extraordinary cross-council collaborative ideas that have bubbled up. And then, there are the mission-led elements, which are very broad, net zero sustainability type questions, which are key priorities for the world, let alone the country. And if we can bring in some top-down view that captures the extraordinary things that are happening on the bottom in a way that allows one to plug gaps, connect disconnected parts, bring things together that would otherwise not have met, then that I think is the extraordinary opportunity we have at UKRI because everything is under the same umbrella. In terms of Palab's question about top-down tick box, I'm actually not quite sure what that refers to. I haven't ticked any boxes since I've got to UKRI. But maybe there are some specific issues that those lab heads are mentioning. I do know that if you're working in essentially a civil service organisation, there are lots of civil servicey type rules and hoops that one has to jump through. But I'm hoping I'm getting better at jumping through them in the way that doesn't actually interrupt my direction of travel.
Very good. Thank you, Otterlyn. And of course, there has been actually recently another bureaucracy busting exercise and a simplification of UKRI procedures on things like applying for research grants, I think. Now, there's one strand which was very important in what Otterlyn said at the beginning, and which Priya in particular also touched on, is people and people moving around. And one of our top questions is from Fionnuala Costello, saying, how can we support the movement of individuals across academia, research and technology organizations and business? And if I may give a modest plug to the foundation itself, we have launched in the last year our own Future Leaders program, which aims precisely at promoting some of those connections. And we've had some success in linking relatively early stage career researchers with Whitehall and the world of commerce. And we've also, I think, had a related idea from Dougal Goodman, who was the previous director of the FST, typically ingenious idea on the, as we know, the problem of postdocs and the uncertainties of their career path. He says, could postdocs be employed by an agency who look after their mentoring, training and development? Universities would pay for agency researchers but not employ them. An ingenious idea. So let's talk a little bit about how actually this movement of people in the ecosystem can be promoted. Let's start, as you touched on this as well, Priya. Why don't you set the ball rolling?
Sure. So as you will have gathered from my remarks, I think this is absolutely fundamental for our ability to deliver the promise of the whole sort of R to D end of this equation. I would add two specific examples that I think could really shift the dial. One is, I do think from a business perspective, our rules around non-compete do constrain the ability for people to move between businesses. And actually what has been incredibly successful in Silicon Valley is the reality that someone can leave working for Google on a Friday and on a Monday be working at Apple, and that is normal for the ability to share talent amongst the top businesses. The second example is a bit harder to articulate, but I think for me is around culture. I think there are lots of great schemes, as you rightly referenced, David, in place to support this, not least the Future Leaders Fellowship that Fionnuala was referring to. But I think we have to get comfortable about an academic having business interests, about a business person having academic interests. And we're not yet quite there collectively as a culture. So I think anything everyone can do to shift that dial, to make it the norm that someone who's an academic could have business interests on the side, someone who's in business could have an academic career in parallel, would be, I think, really good for everybody.
Thank you very much. Yes, and I remember you're educating me on this, the Californian Supreme Court striking down non-compete clauses as crucial to the rise of Silicon Valley. Very interesting and important point. Let's hear now from David, your observations on this.
Yeah, I feel like I call this grayware. The grayware is everything. The hardware and the software is the structures that we can build. But the hardware and the software is only as good as the grayware that goes into it. And so it's got to be about people. It's got to be about the hardware too, because the good people are very mobile and they will go to where the right hardware is and the right software is. So if we don't have the infrastructure, you're not going to keep them. in science. So it's a bit of both. The UKRI fellows, future fellows is terrific. More networks to join people up, I think, is terrific. But I would make the observation that it's not sort of one shoe fits all, because although we talk about interdisciplinarity, there are a lot of scholars that like to work by themselves and do great things. And so I think we have to accommodate them in the system. You know, we need to be able to accommodate the Andrew Wileses to go and lock himself up in his room for 7 years to solve Fermat's last theorem. Now, when you talk to Andrew, he doesn't need to do interdisciplinary research. You know, he's quite open about that. So I think at one end, whilst we are talking about people and advancing them through systems, I think we've also got to be big enough to realize that we do have people that quite like to work in isolation too. So I think the signs of a mature science base is to take all types and to have very good role models in the system. I think this is important. Like, who do you aspire to? Who do you most admire as a scientist? And to be able to get, everyone's got to feel that they've got the opportunity to get there. Everyone, irrespective of where you come from and what's your starting point. And I think inclusivity here is very important to the next generation as we move through. And leading institutions have to demonstrate that right at the top, all the way through.
Thank you very much. Ottilien, over to you. And this, depending on how long, this might be your sort of last word, because we've only got 3 or 4 minutes left. And do comment on that. You might like, in addition, to comment on a specific point, given which is one group of people that we've been told we need more of is systems engineers. Can you do more to promote systems engineers? And I think more widely, people would be interested to know what is at the top of your in tray. What are the issues you are wrestling with as you look forward along that exciting path for UKRI?
Gosh, so you know, back to the people to start with, I completely agree. At some level, what we're talking about is diversity in all its many manifestations. So different sorts of careers for different sorts of people, and we have to have a system that values that wide range of different sorts of careers. And lifelong learning, coming into research very late from some other background, moving out from research, and all of those things we need to recognize and value and support that, because fundamentally high quality research and innovation is about difference. It's about disagreement. It's about that kind of rubbing up together of ideas that hadn't met before. And that's where a lot of the really exciting things happen. And absolutely, you can be locked in your room, but even the people locked in their room had Fermat. It wasn't a completely isolated experience. So I think difference and valuing it and creating a system that incentivizes and supports that is really important. And that, I think, is one of the things that we have failed to do, almost accidentally, by thinking it becomes fair to assess everybody on the same criteria, and that we need to assess everybody on the same criteria because that's the way to include people. And actually, that's the best way to exclude people, because then you only get people who meet those rather narrow criteria. So we have to think much more sophisticated way, I think, about the way we assess research and researchers, to make sure that we capture difference and value difference and support portfolios of ideas and portfolios of people moving through portfolio careers. So yes, now what else was I asked? Systems engineers, I love systems engineers. They provide really wonderful ways of thinking about things, and we definitely need more of them, and we need more engineers altogether. But I must say, systems thinking comes from a variety of different places, and there's plenty of systems biology and all kinds of other systems. And I think actually the different ways of thinking about those systems is also really important. And we're back to diversity again. What's top on my list? Short term, getting a decent amount of joined up thinking about the R&D settlement in the spending review, not just money for UKRI, money across government to restore some of the science capability across government, which I think is really crucial for making these high quality, build back better R&D driven economy decisions. And then I guess I would argue these questions that have been touched on about shifting the culture, the way we think about research and innovation. It is about people, but it's about all kinds of people, not just shiny researchers, kind of Einstein figures. Everybody who's working in the research and innovation system can rightly feel proud of their contributions, whether they're the person locked in the room solving Fermat's last theory, or the person making the tea. Because I can tell you, having worked in a variety of places, the person who makes the tea is an absolutely crucial part of any kind of research and innovation environment. And all of those people need to feel like they're driving that R&D system, because they are. And that's how you build this much more inclusive view of a knowledge economy, which is what we need to do to share some of that excitement and enthusiasm and positivity that there is fundamentally in our ability to solve the problems that we're facing.
Thank you very much indeed, Otlin. What a great note on which to end. We're grateful to all three of our speakers for excellent contributions this evening. And we're also grateful to the Physiological Society for sponsoring the event. A report of the proceedings will be up on our website in the next few days. And our next event on the 25th of November is on online teaching in higher education post-COVID. Michelle Donnellan, the university's minister, will be joining us for that discussion. Thank you all indeed very much for participating today. Some excellent questions and very illuminating answers. Thank you all.